Hello and welcome to Photographic Connections, the podcast where we create connection to self, nature and others through the art of photography. My name is Kim Grant, the founder of Photographic Connections and your host for this podcast. And today I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Dan Ruffles onto the podcast. Dan is a landscape photographer based in Suffolk, England. He has a deep love and connection with his local area and finds beauty to photograph all around him. We speak about how being by the coast and in solitude helps him to feel calm, how he combines his photography with different concepts by writing reflective pieces on his website journal, and how using a film camera really enables him to slow down. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dan Ruffles. Hi Dan, thank you so much for coming on to the podcast this week. I discovered you recently on Instagram and I was really taken by your images. I found them just to be so beautiful, and when I discovered you I went onto your website and read a little bit more about you and where you're based and your process, and I really felt like you'd be a really good guest for the podcast. So thank you so much for coming on. And before we delve more into your process and your love for your local area, I wondered if you could go back to the beginning and explain your journey into photography.
Yeah, so initially I started, it must have been just over 10 years ago now. I'd always had an interest in photography as a youngster. So my father gave me like a simple kind of point and shoot camera. And I was often walking around, kind of going out with them, capturing kind of things that caught my eye. And then there was kind of a gap from there where it was only sort of within sort of 10 or so years ago, I picked up again and had an interest at the time in automotive, motorsport. So I was going to a lot of local events there and catching a lot of vehicles, motorsport racing, bike racing, and so on. And it was initially kind of this pull to the landscape that started to draw me in, because I was always aware that we had so much kind of close by. So at the time I was living in Norfolk before I moved to Suffolk, but I was kind of only sort of 40 minutes or so from a lot of these locations, which are close to me now. So I was kind of using it as a bit of a tool really to get out and explore and trying to kind of read and understand the landscape. And it was from there where it went from sort of being something that I'd maybe do sort of once a month to kind of something that I'd be doing any kind of free moment I had. So most weekends I'd be going up to the coast shooting, sort of maybe spending a day or two there, and then trying to sort of squeeze in anything in the middle as well. Of that, because that's the thing, we're kind of blessed with so much close by, and I think for me it's kind of always been quite a good excuse to kind of get out, if you like. So I think my Alexa's now kicking in. So it's yeah, in terms of like the journey and the process, I think it sort of seems that although I say I've been doing it for 10 years, I'd say for sort of like the last 5 or 6 especially, it's kind of been more of a deep sort of set process where I've kind of been more kind of rooted in kind of like harnessing sort of things like composition, light, and so on, and revisiting places to kind of not sort of like to heavily be harsh on myself, but revisiting them to kind of build up on what I've seen already, or spot something slightly different, or kind of understand how I'm seeing it differently to how I saw it before, if that makes sense. So it's kind of from there, it's built up to kind of then seeing more details in the landscape as well. So instead of kind of just going to a kind of like a key location that's familiar to everyone, I can kind of go there and sort of see other things. I think you've spoken about it a little bit in some of your videos as well, where that sort of slowing down process, you can kind of start to be more aware of the details and what's around you in the landscape.
So the Suffolk Coast clearly has had a really deep impression on you, and being so close to it as well, it makes sense why you love it so much. But what do you think it is about the Suffolk Coast specifically that really speaks to you?
It's an area that's known for its big, wide open skies. I think we're unfortunately not kind of blessed in terms of the more sort of hilly, dramatic environments, sort of say around sort of the likes of Wales, Scotland, the Lake District, and so on. But it has its own kind of unique charm with those open vistas, and especially with light as well. It seems to no sort of day kind of feels the same, and there are some parts especially that can really sing when you've kind of got those overcast or dramatic conditions. So it's kind of, I would say, over the period of time, kind of capturing it, I've kind of learnt to really read the landscape and become very familiar with it, and kind of knowing that what kind of location would work well for me depending on the conditions.
Yeah, and you'd mentioned there the love for the big skies and how the Suffolk coast has so
Mm,
much bounty, I guess, for viewing these wonderful big skies. And I know that you gain a lot of inspiration from looking up at the sky. So, what do you think it is about being somewhere like the Suffolk coast and having this vast expanse in front of you? You know, how does it make you feel, and where do you think that inspiration comes from?
So yeah, when I do find, I mean, there are some locations, Shingle Streets being one of them. Um, you can kind of arrive there, and you kind of feel it's very remote, and even when it's quite busy, you can kind of feel that you're there just on your own, and there's a kind of a calmness to it, and a relaxed feeling to it. And I think for me, initially with photography, it's a good way to kind of escape that everyday noise. It's a place that you can easily go and just switch off. And as much as I'm sort of 10 minutes away from the beach in Aldeburgh in terms of walking, but just kind of getting in a car and sort of being somewhere else in 20, 25 minutes, it can make a real difference to sort of your general well-being and just calmness as well. It's a real nice place for to just go and switch off.
Yeah, many photographers say that they love this solitude, the calmness, the being in a remote location and almost feeling like, you know, you're there completely on your own and completely immersed in the landscape. It can be so inspiring
Mm.
for many people. Do you find that's really important for your process, you know, really being there on your own without all that distraction of other people around you?
Yeah, most definitely. I find sometimes when we get the summer months, especially with the children being on holidays and so on, that the places can become very busy. And it's almost that if you arrive to that location when it's like that, you get a completely different sense from it. You don't necessarily immerse yourself in it in the same way. So, I definitely like that element of kind of just being there by myself and in my own thoughts, and kind of just embracing the landscape as well. Sometimes it's as much as I'll go with the intention to capture some images. Sometimes if I don't, just being there and enjoying it, that's kind of the reason I sometimes have to look for being there rather than trying to force myself into doing something in terms of capturing an image.
What you describe there is very much a state of mindfulness. And I know on your website you do have a blog post on Zen and mindfulness. So it's definitely something
Mm,
you've considered and thought about in your own practice. So I wondered if you could delve a little bit more deeply into this, because it's something I've spoken about to a number of guests now, is this mindfulness element and how photography really helps people to connect with mindfulness and the benefits that it brings. So yeah, how does that play out in your process?
yeah, so I find that it allows me to like going out with a camera kind of allows me to switch off from thinking about anything else that's gone on the week, whether it's just if you've had a busy week or you've had some stress on elsewhere or you've just got a lot going on in your head. Generally, I find that if I go for a walk, if I'm with the camera, if I'm constantly looking, and that can be at the landscape as a whole or it can be at details, um, it just kind of removes that. It just brings this complete element of calm, where that's the only kind of thing that I'm thinking about or focusing on. And that kind of, I think over the years, especially, it's kind of evolved how I see things in the landscape.
Yeah, you mentioned there this idea that mindfulness really helps you to see things a little bit differently over the years. So, how do you feel it's helped with that? Do you think it's just the slowing down and really noticing? Is that kind of how you would describe how it helps with you?
Yeah, definitely. There is the element of slowing down. Um, you just take that moment of pause in the landscape, and I do find that I think I'd mentioned to you previously that I sort of shoot film alongside digital, which I think has aided a lot of that slowing down as well, just because you know that you're kind of restricted in terms of how many images that you can take. Your framing as well is a lot more key. The way you kind of think about it is a lot different, and I think that has translated over time into how I work just generally in photography.
And I guess we bring this mindfulness approach together with the solitude and being in a remote location, like you spoke about earlier. One thing I read on your website is that you feel particularly inspired by sunrise. Now, of course, sunrise at certain times of the year is times of day when there's very little people around and where you can really feel this sense of solitude. Do you think that's why sunrise particularly is of interest to you and, of course, combined with everything else that it brings?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, in terms of if you're going to go for sort of either morning or evening, it's definitely where everything is situated here, being on the East Coast. Sunrises kind of deliver the sort of better part of light of the day in terms of subject. Um, and it's nice. I like I say, it's that first point of call in the morning. You're out usually by yourself. Some locations you may arrive and there's about 10 other photographers there, sort of pushing for the sort of same spot. But it's kind of at times when it's been like that, that's kind of when I've walked further and kind of seen other bits of the landscape that have actually sort of picked more of an interest. I think you'd mentioned it recently where you'd kind of frantically arrived somewhere, um, tried to rush to capture that morning colour, but then ended up getting sort of stronger, more thoughtful images later in the morning just by that moment of slowing down. I've definitely experienced that a few times, I'd say recently, where I've kind of tried to steer away from the sort of bigger key locations, but kind of looking what's around that. But don't know, definitely morning. I think it always kind of gives me a positive sort of start to the day. Just sort of making that first start and kind of getting home at kind of getting home at mid morning. There's kind of already been like that sense of achievement, if you like, that's kind of got you started for the day.
I love that you mentioned that because I think maybe that's something some people battle with is, if you don't get out there early in the morning and really get into your photography from the start of the day, you can feel quite, almost as the day progresses, some people really struggle to get out. It's like their motivation starts to
Mm,
wane and they might think, oh, I want to go out for sunset, but for one reason or another, they struggle with it. But I know in my own practice, if I get up early and I go out before I have a chance for any other stresses to come into my day, it's almost like you say, you've been out there early, you've got it done, and it really helps your day begin on a really positive note, doesn't it?
mm. No, definitely. And I do find that it's I just find that I think as I mentioned to you a second ago, that just general element of being out in it, it's kind of it's a good sort of tool to get you out and exploring. I think sometimes I notice like when weather's kind of a little bit sort of poor like it is at the moment, there's still opportunities there, but you kind of feel less inclined. And sometimes I do try and push and keep that momentum up just to kind of keep my kind of practice running. Because sometimes as I've found, it's you don't necessarily always need that kind of morning light to kind of deliver something. It can be, a detail or something that you've seen, or the dramatic element of conditions that can and also help elevate a landscape.
Yeah, it's almost like when you head out in the morning, you can't really have any preconceived ideas. We can look out the
Mm,
window and look at the weather forecast and kind of gauge what the weather may do. But I think the beauty of heading out there first thing in the morning when it's still a bit dark is you don't really know what's going to unfold. So even when you are
mm,
greeted with less than favourable conditions, as some people may call them, you may not be quite as disappointed, or maybe not disappointed, but you're already out there, so you tend to make the most of it rather than during the day when you can kind of look at the light and the clouds and try and articulate what may happen. It's like you're already out there where there's almost that element of surprise. And I know I've seen some incredible sunrises that I've not expected to happen
mm.
because it didn't look like it by the forecast, but you head out there and you're pleasantly surprised, and it's like that night turning into day. There's something so incredibly beautiful about it.
Yeah, no, I'm 100% with you there. And I think as well, I've tried not to put too much pressure on myself as well to try and I think sometimes the expectations versus reality they're always they often can be very different to each other. So I think it's kind of more I've always kind of had in my head if I can get one shot that I'm really pleased with in a morning or an early afternoon or whatever when I've gone out, then it's been a success.
One thing I really loved is on your website, you've written, through my photography, I write a visual love letter to Suffolk. I wondered if you could go a little bit more into detail about this, because although it's quite clear what you mean by that, I just think it's lovely, the words, a visual love letter to Suffolk.
Yeah, so through my photography, what I've always tried to do is capture a sense of place. a kind of an evocative feeling through the work, that kind of connects with people, that especially those that are familiar with the area or that visit the area. And I kind of hope that with my work, it kind of shows that deep connection rather than kind of feeling like an everyday shot of various locations that people recognize around here, that there's something to it that is you gravitate to. It has a feeling, it has an emotion to it.
So I'd mentioned earlier about your website blog, or as you call it, your website journal. And I love this because you really explore different concepts that link to, in some respects, sort of philosophical thoughts, as well as almost like the meaning of life. And you link it in with your photography. And some of your journal submissions on your website include things like the essence of time and exploring the unseen. And as I'd mentioned earlier, the one on Zen and mindfulness. So I was really intrigued about how you feel writing this journal on your website and combining it with your imagery. How does that process, do you feel, really work together and help you bring your photography into a different media?
So some of the concepts, I'd recently joined in on a couple of photo walks locally, um, that where each one we were kind of given a theme to capture. So that one being essence of um, time and exploring the unseen. A couple of these locations were new to me at the time. Um, so it kind of going in with a concept or a thought initially did allow me to think very differently on what I was capturing and look at things very differently as well, with kind of an element in mind of what is my interpretation of time, what is my interpretation of seeing the unseen, and which has been really good actually. And I never really sort of was sure how I would feel initially on a photo walk, whether there'd be a lot of distraction or equally it's good to the networking element is really good. But actually kind of having a sort of a concept or a thought beforehand, when I then look at those images, when I then revisit them, which I try to do sort of a couple of days after, just so then they'd feel fresh. Um, I can kind of it's kind of like they start to piece together a bit of a story, not just from the day, but kind of mentally how I saw that kind of expression to the concept. So usually I initially sort of will put a few bullets down of what I see in say three or four images based around that theme, and then from there it kind of strings that piece together in the journal. And getting that all out there I found it very positive for me, writing those thoughts down. Um, you may think them at the time when you look at them, but I think once you've written them down, you've kind of built that structure of how you then start seeing things around you then from that point, if that makes sense, when you go out again.
It's interesting because a question I get asked a lot is, what do you do with your images after you've gone out and created them? And, it's quite often, apart from creating my YouTube videos and posting them on social media, I don't really do much with them. Of course, I've got some ideas of the future of doing things like books and different projects with them. But I really like what you've brought in here because, going out and exploring a different concept when you're out with your camera and seeing what comes up for you and whether I guess it helps you to delve a bit deeper into certain subjects and different mediums and different thoughts. It almost brings a sense of maybe self-discovery and self-development
Hmm.
into your work and bringing you and I guess your mind and the things that you're exploring into the imagery. You'd mentioned there about telling a story, and it really is. It's like bringing many concepts together to create something almost of meaning that you're then sharing with the
Hmm.
world through your website. And that I'm sure many people, when they read what you've articulated there and brought the writing together with the imagery, it's also maybe inspiring them to see their photography a bit differently and maybe delve more into these concepts as well.
Yeah, I'd hope so. I mean, I think that the trouble is and I've spoken to a few people recently that have said that you can go to all these locations that are nearby us, but after a while feel that you've captured everything, that there's nothing else more to then see. And I know I've been in that position before, because I was sort of starting out just focusing on those key locations, and those key spots, those key photographs. Um, and kind of now I feel I've sort of expanded how I view my surroundings, that there's almost change everywhere. There's almost a picture in everything. Um, and there's also feeling in that as well. I very much believe that what you capture on that day is an element of how you feel. You could go another time and see the same thing, but see it in a completely different way. I think it kind of ties into that mindfulness element again, that you're bringing that emotion, that kind of evocative element into your photography.
I love what you said there because I can totally resonate, about almost every time you go to a location, the images you create are really much based on your feeling and your emotion that day. And, we can return to the same location every day for a month and come away with
Mm,
completely different images because every day we will feel slightly different. And because we feel slightly different, we may connect with different things. The light's going to be different, the colours are going to be different, what's available may potentially be different, which opens up different ideas in our minds as well. And then when we
mm.
bring that together with what you're doing with many of these concepts, it's beautiful, and it definitely does tie in very well with the mindfulness. And I hope people listening to this, if they maybe struggle photographing more locally or feel there's no opportunities, it may just help them to think a little bit about actually there is probably a lot locally that I can connect with. And if I think a little bit more about my emotions that day, or feel into them, and really kind of see if it does change what I photograph and how I feel when I'm out there. And it just, yeah, it brings a much more personal approach to our photography and almost more reward and value for us as individuals as well.
Definitely. It was, I mean, recently I'd gone out, I'd arrived at a location, it's about a 5 minute drive from where I live. And I arrived there wondering initially what I'm actually here to capture. The sunset was beautiful, but there was kind of no sort of set plan. I just had a pull to go there. And then interestingly, I think it came from seeing your video where you were going to I think you were going to a local pond for 4 days, or a local lake, and there's a mere basically, and I could see the light kind of hitting and rippling the water, and there was a lot of loose leaves and a lot of texture and a lot of detail that I was kind of gravitating towards, and I had my macro lens with me as well, so the kind of elements that I was capturing specifically in focus, there was almost an abstract nature to those images.
And abstract photography is a really good way, isn't it, of bringing more meaning or more opportunity into our local area. We get the chance to try something different and see something from a different angle. And of course, abstract photography is not for everyone, but sometimes when you are
Mm.
struggling to see opportunities, if you try something a bit more abstract, whether it's just abstract in what you've created, whether it's using different focal lengths, different depths of field, or even trying more artistic forms of photography like intentional camera movement or multiple exposures, you can bring so many more opportunities into your local area, which can really heighten your creativity and your self exploration.
Yeah, definitely. And I was really pleased with what I came back with as well. Again, it was kind of, as soon as I started to see these details, I just immersed myself in that moment, in capturing some of those images. And they do hold up in my view as being, they've got their own strength to them. And it's made me want to explore that style a little bit further. And like I say, it was something that was initially unplanned on arrival, um, but it just kind of naturally came once I spotted it. It was, I guess it ties into that element of looking, that element of seeing.
And one thing we'd spoken about on Instagram, which I think plays really well into everything we've been talking about today, is I posted something the other week and you'd sent me a nice comment about it. And it was about how almost slowing down and changing our approach to photography. I was sharing how I used to be a very anxious photographer and how I've moved into being a bit more slower and contemplative and more mindful in my approach. And you'd shared with me that this slower approach for you has been almost developed by the fact that you use a lot of film cameras back in the day,
Mm.
and this slower approach that you've got to um, use in the film cam with and this slower approach that you've got to use with film cameras has really allowed you to adapt that into using a digital camera. So I wondered if you could explain that a little bit more for anyone who's maybe not tried film before, or who maybe has but is maybe struggling to bring that slower approach into their digital photography.
So I've found, so I use a medium format film camera, which depending on which one I'm using, you can either take a maximum of 10 shots or 12 shots per roll. So you've got to be more you can't kind of take 20 shots of a subject and pick one. It's not as easy as blasting through images. So you do slow down in terms of you see something, you frame it first off, but then you kind of pause for that moment, reframe it, consider different options. I think your mind's thinking a bit more consciously on the image. I think we're very accustomed to going somewhere with a digital camera and knowing that we can fire off hundreds of shots of a location until we kind of get it right. I think film kind of pulls you away a little bit from that because you can't do that. You've got to be a little bit more slowed down. But that has aided how I see things as well. It's interesting. I sort of find that, I don't know if you've thought it as well, but the work that I've taken on analog almost seems like it comes from a different eye to the work taken on digital.
It's really interesting because I personally don't have all that much knowledge on different cameras. I've only ever used DSLRs and mirrorless cameras, so I've never tried film and everything else, and the micro two thirds and all that kind of stuff. I don't really have much knowledge of any of it, but it's really nice to hear how everyone's approach and their journey into photography, how depending on what cameras you began with, how it then potentially influences your photography as you progress. And of course, there's a lot of people now going back to film because they like the more slower contemplative approach, and the fact that you can't just take hundreds or thousands of images. You really have to be more considerate about what you are photographing, how many images you're taking, and really think about each step-by-step process of creating an image. It's like we all have our personal preferences, but it is interesting to see many photographers going back to film because it's almost it speaks to them in ways that I guess digital doesn't always.
There's an element as well to each stock will give its own look, whether you're shooting the likes of, say, portrait or gold, or some of the black and white stocks such as HP5 Triax. They have their own kind of depth, color tone, so on. That I find that when I kind of get those images back, there's very little involved there's barely anything involved in terms of post-processing. It may just be a case of applying an S-curve or add a smidgen of sharpness, but there's a softness and there's kind of a very organic feel to those images, almost as if you could step into them. And I do find at times that you lose a little bit that with digital in some respects. But I wouldn't say it's a case of, I'm not one of these that will be like one or the other. I kind of welcome both into my practice because they both kind of deliver me different results or different feelings of my work.
And it's interesting to see how all that process you've been through and everything you've discovered through the film photography, how it's aided your work in becoming very emotive in many ways. And we can't finish off today without mentioning the fact that the other week you won Coastal View category in the Landscape Photographer of the Year. So firstly, a huge congratulations for that.
Thank you.
It's wonderful to hear that you've had this achievement, and I think plays testament to the fact that you are very mindful in your approach, and that these emotions and everything we've spoken about today, about slowing down, being very connected with your local area, learning to see it in new ways, how bringing all of that together has allowed you to create an image that also speaks to many other people as well.
Yeah, it was such a huge, such a massive positive boost for me. I entered it in 2020, and I had a few images shortlisted, which I was really pleased about. And unfortunately, the competition is very big, and I didn't sort of progress anymore from being shortlisted. And I saw that as itself it was good to get that far in the competition. And then I took a couple of years out from then entering, not through any negativity at all. I think it was just. It's one of those things where I enjoy capturing the work, but when it comes to entering competitions or doing the admin, and sometimes there's perhaps a little bit of imposter syndrome in there or self-doubt as well with entering these things, that I just sort of had a bit of a gap from doing it. And then it was this year that I decided to re-enter. I had a number of images that I'd taken over the last couple of years that I just felt stood very strongly. or to me anyway. I think that that's the main thing. The images I take, they're not. I'm not someone that would like to capture images just for competitions. They're very sort of personal and connected to my process. So yeah, I'm very glad that I did, because it was, yeah, when I heard that I was in sort of the final round and in the lineup, it was, yeah, it was very exciting, very exciting.
Yeah, it's great news. It really is. And, of course, competitions aren't for everybody. And you mentioned there about this idea of imposter syndrome that I know so many people experience. Even some of the most
Mm,
acclaimed photographers still feel this imposter syndrome. But, there's no denying that competitions in some respects can help us to get our work out there, to be put into exhibitions, to potentially for some people it has even helped them to make a career in photography, which is
mm,
is fantastic. But it's always about weighing up, why we enter these competitions. And it's brilliant that you, first and foremost, photography is really for you. It's like a self-exploration, it's a connection, and just being able to enter such a prestigious competition and be successful in it is a beautiful bonus that I guess you just weren't
mm.
quite expecting.
And it's lovely as well that the image is of my local area. It was when we had the snow a couple of years back, and just being able to kind of spend a couple of hours. I mean, crazily, I think for some, just stomping around your local area trying to capture this element that's just coming down. It's really nice to see that. I think it's not kind of like I've traveled for that work or anything. It's on my local doorstep, and I think that's where that personal connection is also tied into creating that image as well. That sort of familiarity and sense of place.
It definitely pays testament to the personal connection that you just mentioned there. There's something really, when somebody has a really deep personal connection with what they're photographing, it really shows in their images. If you're just going out there photographing things, maybe you're told make good images, or photographing in light that we're told is good for photography.
Mm,
I always find images lack something, but when the photographer who's created them has that personal connection and love for what they're photographing, it really shows in the imagery. And everything you've shared today, I think, is definitely testament of that. And it really shows the importance to anyone listening. Photograph what really speaks to you, what you personally feel connected to, and your images will speak volumes as a result.
no, I wholly agree. I wholly agree with that. I think I've often struggled if I've kind of gone and taken, say, 3 days, 3 or 4 days somewhere out, and it's great exploring somewhere different, but it really takes time to build that connection. I think you kind of initially want to run to everywhere that's familiar to you or what you've seen already, but you don't kind of get that feeling when you look back at them, sort of in the coming days after. Um, so I think because I've really kind of focused heavily on just this local area and making the most of what's nearby, that really kind of sings out in my work. And I think that's what I sort of mentioned earlier with your sort of spotting of the visual love letter to Suffolk comment, is that it's kind of tying in that kind of evocative emotion to the landscape that hopefully other people get from those images as well, and they don't see them as like a standard shot of an
Yeah.
area.
Yeah, definitely. And the fact that everything you do is local as well, it means it's accessible to you, and it's easy to get to, and it means you can get out there with your
Mm.
camera regularly, which always helps us as well in keeping our photography going and keeping that passion burning.
Yes, no, definitely, definitely. It's there's always something that it's my fear that one day I'll go to loads of places and just not see anything. I'll kind of lose touch. But I think as long as I think the enthusiasm is always there, and it's like I mentioned earlier, it's your reason for being there or my reason for being there is not necessarily just to capture. It's also being out in the element, out in nature, and just enjoying that moment in time.
Well, brilliant, Dan. Thank you so much for your time today. It's been lovely to speak with you. And for anyone that's resonated with your story, or they'd like to go in and look and read some of your journal articles on your website, where can they go to connect with you?
So my Instagram is at Daniel Ian Photography, and my website is danielianphotography.com.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I'll put all the
No,
links
thank
to all
you.
of that in the
Thank
show
you.
notes below. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this week's podcast. It really does mean the world to me. If you'd like to get further involved with Photographic Connections, including joining our very supportive online members community, you can find all the details at photographicconnections.com. And now that this podcast has come to an end, there's only one thing left for you to do. It's time to pick up your camera and head outdoors. There's so many incredible photographic opportunities just waiting for you to discover.